I am absolutely delighted to see everybody here. This is an amazing mix of just, former students, current students, friends, people who are interested in this topic, certainly our valued alumni, members of the law school, and just colleagues. And I hope this will be a really good discussion. So I wanted to first, let me welcome everybody to this. I'm excited that you're here. Obviously, this is a topic that is of great importance to all of us. It's a current topic, it's a timely topic, and also, I think all of us, even though, we've been really dealing with this since March or maybe a little bit before, we're all still, I think, trying to process what it is that's going on with this deadly virus and how we can best, in our own ways, to the best of our abilities, keep ourselves safe, keep our communities safe, and looking beyond that, to the country and the rest of the world. What can we do to stop this in its tracks, or at least find a better way to prevent it? I wanted to say right off the bat, just full disclosure, I am an advocate for vaccines. This is something that I'm passionate about. And so while, of course, this talk will be more focused on, what I hope is viewed as objective, I want to present a little bit of the data about the science, though the focus here will, of course, be the legal aspects of this. I do have, as I think, many of us do, a personal connection to this. I'm a mom of 4 boys. Anyone who's had me in a class has heard all about them, has gone through their life stages with me. 3 of them have a rare primary immune disease, and they are basically working with half their immune system. For them, and it's kind of interesting to be talking about vaccines because I have 3 boys who are not vaccinated. They're not vaccinated because they can't be medically, because their immune system has no memory. And so if they got a vaccine, it would, perhaps at best have a neutral effect. At worst, depending on the type of vaccine, it could make them pretty sick. Though I also want to say that with vaccines in development for the virus that causes COVID-19, there may actually be some data that even kids like mine with these half-functioning immune systems might be able to be vaccinated. So there's just a lot of new stuff going on. But historically, for me, my advocacy for vaccines has been based just on, concerns about public health that, I hope many of us share, but also very personally, a need for what I'll refer to as community immunity, and the need for people around us to be vaccinated so that we don't have any diseases that are vaccine preventable that are popping up. Let me remind everybody that this is being recorded. You can find it on the John Marshall YouTube page when it is, after the recording is done and we've had a chance to post it. So again, this is being recorded, so any comments you make publicly, will be recorded. I very much welcome conversation about this and comments about this. Probably the easiest way to do that is to just type in something into chat. You can also raise your hand, and I will keep an eye out for people who are raising their hands and try to get to you as quickly as I can. I have about 30 minutes or so worth of stuff that I am eager to present to you. And at that point, I would love to open it up to conversation. But as I always tell my students as well, even while I'm presenting, while I'm going through this PowerPoint, if there's anything you want to comment on or ask, please don't hesitate to do so. I really want you to be a part of this conversation. I think the more people who are talking about it, the more information we can share and the closer we can come as lawyers to perhaps finding what we can do as lawyers to find some solutions to this. So again, please feel free to jump in via chat, and then I'll definitely have dedicated time where I will really encourage you to jump in via chat. I don't call on people. But I do have some talking points for us at the end of this if nobody has questions, but I hope there will be questions. I wanted to say also that I'm very, very grateful to UIC John Marshall Law School, to Dean Darby Dickerson, Dean Art Acevedo, Dean Julie Spanbauer for encouraging these, and to the absolute rockstar team at Marketing and Communications Department, Michael Huggins and Miller McDonald, who are joining us here, and Peggy Zimba, who does all of our public events. We have an amazing team at UIC John Marshall that makes presentations like this possible. So I'm grateful for that. Also, since we are now very excited about this, since we are part of UIC, part of what I really hope to do in the future is collaborate with my colleagues on the other parts of campus. There have been some really great presentations. Recently, there was a presentation by 2 alums from the UIC College of Pharmacy about vaccines. So I hope that being a part of a larger research university will help us in collaboration with lots of things that we do at the law school. Quick note about terminology. The disease itself that we're talking about is called coronavirus disease, or COVID-19. And the virus that causes it is SARS-CoV-2. The reason that I just want to be clear about this terminology is because when we talk about a vaccine, it's a vaccine technically for the virus, and not, it's a vaccine to address the disease, but it's a vaccine to stimulate in some ways and to stop the virus. So I just wanted to put that out there. I think a lot of us use these terms interchangeably. Okay, so let's get started. And by way of, introduction, and tragically, this is one of those things, this is one of those slides that I kept revising because the numbers keep going up. Literally I finished this yesterday. Best data I had was 143,000 deaths. And, I checked this morning and it's 144,000. I think we all see, I don't want to belabor the point of how deadly this is. And the important thing to note here is that, obviously, although the focus of this talk is more on the US, because I want to talk about the US legal system, this is a disease, of course, that is ravaging the whole world. So I don't mean to give any kind of impression that my only concern is the United States. It's certainly not. But my focus here will be on the United States because I think for many of us, more immediately, this is where we can focus our attention and our energy. One of the things that, no doubt you've heard discussed, because this has been a big topic of conversation, is this idea of herd immunity, or as I'll refer to it, community immunity. My friend Karen Ernst, who runs the amazing website Voices for Vaccines, reminds me often that community immunity is just a better term to use, and I like that better. It means the same thing. The idea is that if enough people are immune to this virus, then the community itself is protected. So the idea that, the more people are immune, the less likely the virus is to spread, the less likely people are to pass it along. And the idea of establishing a good level of community immunity is pretty crucial in the fighting of coronavirus. Passive immunity is something that I just want to mention briefly. This is when you hear about people getting antibodies, passively getting antibodies into their bodies that will help them fight this particular disease. For people who are on intravenous immunoglobulin, IVIG replacement therapies, or other types of therapies, there's some value to passive immunity. But for most everyone else, the real need for stopping this disease is active immunization or finding a vaccine. And that's what I want to focus on. So first, I want us to look at, just vaccines generally, and I'll keep this pretty brief because the science of vaccines is not my area of expertise. And certainly when we open it up to questions and comments, if any of you have comments about that, I absolutely welcome those. But certainly the idea of vaccines is nothing new. There's data to say that this idea goes back, hundreds, if not thousands of years, with the idea of inoculation, teaching the body that if it is under attack by a virus, it can mount its own response. And then with vaccines, forcing that response. I hate to use the term of the vaccine debate because for me, that gives a lot more credibility to the group of people who are small but vocal, that vaccines don't work, just as a blanket statement, or that vaccines are deadly as a blanket statement. I think that there's definitely room to talk about and need to talk about how do we make vaccines safe? Can there be some sort of modified schedule that works for some people? So, I don't mean to say that we can't discuss vaccines, how they're made, how they're tested and all of that. But one of the things we see in this country and really around the world, and no doubt you've heard about this, is very, very vocal groups of people who are opposed to vaccines completely, totally, and then some more, fringe theories about, why vaccines even exist and all of that. The thing that I want to point to with this, and the reason why I want to approach this as a law professor and as a lawyer, is because I think that there are things that we as lawyers can do to be a part of the conversation about vaccines, to help the community understand the value of them, but also to talk about legally why vaccines are important, why they're vital, and why, and this is what I'll get to in just a moment, I think to some extent they can be mandated. The vaccines for SARS-CoV-2 are very much in development. There's a fantastic website that tracks this, the Beacon organization, and for anything that I mention here, cite here, refer to here, I'm more than happy to send anybody who is interested links to the websites and references. I'm very eager to share this information. So if you want that, my email address is on the last slide, and you're more than welcome to reach out to me and I can share links and articles and all of that. So 197 vaccines in development, 197. Amazing, right? For a disease that really hit at least the US very hard in a public way, in March, that's pretty spectacular. Historically, vaccines, of course, are necessarily slow to be developed because you have to develop the vaccine, you have to figure out how it works, you have to figure out whether it is safe, and then you have to, of course, test it and make sure that it's safe. You may have heard about the federal government Operation Warp Speed. The goal of this operation is to get several 100 million vaccines given to people by January 2021. It is a lofty goal. Scientists are really not sure if that goal can be met, but it is, it's a goal nonetheless, and it is something that is encouraging industry, vaccine developers, pharmaceutical corporations to really work on vaccines with government funding and cooperation with the Department of Defense and Department of Health and Human Services. There is some conversation about how a vaccine might be rolled out. And this is from one source that I looked at. There's different data about this, but there's some conversation about rolling it out first to people who are high risk and to first responders, and then rolling it out to everybody else. But, I say rolling out kind of ambitiously. I say rolling out as though it's, a bowl of candy and everybody's going to line up to take some. I think the part of this that we need to think about as lawyers is when we say a vaccine is going to be rolled out, what does that really mean? Is it going to be mandated, and who will do that? And how do we incentivize and encourage people to avail themselves of the vaccine? Because there is data that shows that, in some surveys, maybe as many as 50% of people who are surveyed say that they won't avail themselves of the vaccine, even if it's available. There is always, and especially now with the vaccine for SARS-CoV-2, a really big problem that exists in terms of wanting it to be developed quickly, needing it to be developed quickly, but then also making sure that it is safe effective, and affordable to all, because as with anything we talk about, there are needs of equity. There are communities that may need the vaccine more. There are people who might not be able to afford an expensive vaccine. And so this is another place in a way where I think at least the government may come in, and I think the role of lawyers might be important as well. I got a good question over chat about mandating the vaccines through the Constitution, and I'll get to that in just a moment. I want to talk both about constitutional mandates, but also constitutional objections to vaccines. So I will address that in just a little bit. Okay, so when we talk about the legal side of vaccines, to me, this means a whole bunch of different things, and I hope to touch on some of those today, and if needed, do a follow-up presentation or engage in conversation with anybody who is interested about all of the different facets of this. There is great scholarship being produced about this as well. My colleague at UC Hastings Law School in California, Dorit Rubenstein-Rice, writes excellent papers about this, really good articles, and there are a lot of people thinking about this from the legal side. So for me, when I think about the legal aspects of vaccines, I think about a couple of different things. Part of it, of course, is legislation, laws that are passed to either mandate vaccines, to help fund vaccines, to give directives to governmental health agencies about what they can do and how they need to approach vaccines. To me, it also raises questions about litigation. And one of the interesting things about our legal system is that litigation has been used not just as a way of compensating people for times that they've been harmed when we think about tort litigation. And it's not just, recovery for property or breach of contract or, the whole side of our criminal system, but litigation in the US and other countries as well has sometimes been used as a way of regulating people. For example, medical malpractice lawsuits that exist as a way of defining what doctors can do and what's safe and what's not safe. Kind of the idea that if somebody could be sued for something, maybe they're less likely to do it. With vaccine litigation generally, and any possible litigation about specifically a vaccine that would fight the virus that causes coronavirus, we get into pretty uncharted territory. And I will, I definitely want to touch on that, but also show you why this is somewhat tentative right now. The other component, of course, of what lawyers can do is thinking about actual laws, laws that are passed by the government. And here's where we get into, I think, really interesting questions. One of the things that I'm thinking about and writing about and researching is, what kind of issue is this? Is this a federal issue? Is this a state issue? Is this a local issue? And I think the easiest answer is yes. Yes, it's all of those. And there are different things that can be done at the different governmental levels. And I think that as lawyers, especially when we approach just thinking about a vaccine, or even when we think about any sort of advocacy we might do, or advice that we might give either to advocate, or advice that we might give as a practical matter to an employer who may want to, say, require that all of her employees be vaccinated. I think we need to be mindful of and careful about the laws we're talking about and thinking about, is there a federal law? Is there a state law? Are there local ordinances? And what effect can each of these have? I have laws about litigation, which is, probably the most lawyerly thing I'm going to say in this. And when I typed that, I thought that's a little bit out there. But what I mean here is, if there are going to be possible causes of action that people can bring, either to recover for vaccine injury, which already exists, and I'll show that in the next slide, or if we're using litigation as a way of encouraging greater rates of vaccination, if there are laws that are created that allow for certain causes of action, that create the possibility of people bringing suit, would those laws be created at the federal level, or would those laws be created at the state level? So that's something to think about. And then of course, when we think about laws, there's lots of other things that governmental entities have the particular ability to do at the federal level and at the state level. And that is in terms of insurance coverage, insurance coverage for vaccines, laws about funding for vaccines. So there are a lot of different places where the government can step in. And again, I think there's room for it at all of these different levels, federal, state, and local. I want to talk briefly about the idea of laws specifically. And, here when we talk about laws about vaccines, in addition to the levels that we've already talked about. So when we talk about laws about vaccines, we're already thinking about, are these laws at the federal level, at the state level, or at the local level? So we already have this strata that we've put on it. But then when we start talking about the laws themselves, I think this is where it gets really interesting. And here too, there is a plethora of laws to discuss, again, being mindful of the fact that these are laws that might be passed at the federal level, the state level, or perhaps even local ordinances. One thing that is beyond my area of expertise, but I'm very proud to be at a law school and at a university that thinks about these things, is patent protections. Some of the conversation about incentivizing vaccines has to do with patent protections, and one idea is that if you make it easier to get a patent, that might incentivize research, and that would be a legislative decision. On the other hand, in order to make sure that vaccines are readily available, there's conversation about going the other way and perhaps limiting the number of patents that can be obtained. So arguments on both sides of it. Again, this isn't my area of expertise, but when we think about legislation, that's a piece of the puzzle. What interests me quite a bit is laws about mandating vaccines. And to me, this takes different forms. I think the thing with which we're all most familiar is laws about prohibiting somebody from doing something unless they're vaccinated. Because simply a law that says everybody must get a vaccine or must get a vaccine for a vaccine that protects against the virus that causes coronavirus, a law that says that would be, first, very broad. Second, almost impossible to enforce, right? How do you check that people are doing that? And third, there may be problems with how you even word that and how you make it such a blanket law. So what we've seen historically as attempts to get communities vaccinated and as attempts to encourage community immunity are laws that say that, for example, you can't go to school unless you have a vaccine. And there is some conversation now, and again, each day as I was, updating myself on what's happening with this, I would see new things come up. There's conversation about, could there be a law that says that you can't renew your driver's license unless you've shown proof of vaccination? Somebody suggested that you can't go to the gym unless you have proof of vaccination, which for me would be like, oh, okay, guess I'm not going to the gym again. And also, I think right now it's not quite safe. But there's, are there things that people generally do that one would say you can't allow them to do unless they get a vaccine? And what would those laws look like? And again, back to, are we talking about federal legislation here? or are we talking about legislation state by state? Right now, laws about schools, and I want to talk about those because that is where there's the most robust area of both legislation and then recently changes to the legislation, but then also litigation. Laws about attending school, and something with which I think many people might be familiar. So we know that there are vaccinations that are required, and we know that there are vaccinations to vaccine preventable diseases that are required. There are also exemptions, and I want to talk about those in just a moment. But I think specifically when we talk about a vaccine against this particular disease, against coronavirus, it may even be that because of the transmission rates of this virus, because of the fact that people can be asymptomatic and still be carriers, so we don't even know who is sick, because it can spread so quickly, and because it is so deadly, deadlier than anything we've seen in over 100 years, the question arises, should we maybe talk about that separately? Is that different from a vaccine for pertussis or measles? Now, that's an interesting question to pose in 2020 because, as I think many of you have heard, there have been recurrences of what we thought were not just vaccine preventable, but prevented diseases like pertussis. And there's different, reasons that are given for why this might be happening. But the question, needs to be asked, do we think about the vaccine for the virus that causes coronavirus in a different way? Does it get its own category? Do we allow fewer exemptions for it? The exemptions that exist vary state by state. And here again, when we think about specifically laws that require kids to be vaccinated before they can be in school, all states allow a medical exemption. And, again, this is where I think it would be toughest to say as a blanket statement, no exemptions at all. Now, again, full disclosure, I have 3 kids who have medical exemptions, but they would literally get sick if they got some vaccines, or it would have just no value to them. But B, even with that, and I think importantly, we might even be making the decision if a vaccine is safe enough that they actually get that vaccine, because it may even be possible with some of the vaccines being discussed to fight coronavirus to have a vaccine that works in a way that is safer to be given even to historically vulnerable populations. And again, that gets more to the science of it. But medical exemptions right now exist in every state. 45 states have religious exemptions. 5 states don't, New York being one of the recent ones to get rid of its religious exemption. Interesting, controversial. I mean, this was a big deal. In Illinois, there was actually legislation proposed in January that would eliminate the religious exemption for school attendance without vaccination in Illinois. It was tabled, obviously, once coronavirus hit, but there are conversations about it in many more states that have actually allowed, that have actually gotten rid of religious exemptions. Religious exemptions on their face require that somebody have a sincerely held religious belief that prevents them from being vaccinated. On their face, religious exemptions require really a 2-step process, and part of the problem with religious exemptions is that oftentimes these processes aren't followed. The first is that the person who wants to get a religious exemption has to, and let's use the kids in school as an example. A parent who wants to get a religious exemption for his child needs to go to the doctor. The doctor should be saying, your child needs to be vaccinated. There might be a conversation, again, about a delayed schedule, but ultimately, look, this child needs to be vaccinated to go to school. At this point, the parent says, we have a religious objection to this. The way that the exemptions read, the parent then has the obligation to affirmatively prove that they have this religious belief and that the religious belief specifically prevents them from getting, and at least in Illinois, this is really clearly spelled out, prevents them from getting each and every vaccine to which they object. Now, the reason might be the same for every vaccine to which the parent objects, but there's a pretty high burden of proof required on the parent to explain what those objections are. Some of the scholarship about this talks about how really none of the major religions have anything specific that says that people can't vaccinate. But for me, any conversation about major religions is always problematic because people are of different faiths. We're a diverse nation. So I think it's much more valuable to talk about, specific religious beliefs as they come. But the problem then comes in the fact that the doctor who is not a person of faith or a lawyer has to then evaluate the validity of the parent's statement. Assuming that the doctor agrees with the parent and signs a religious exemption, the doctor first has the burden of explaining to the parent what risks they are taking on. And then the parent then presents the paper of religious exemption to the school. And again, at least on paper in Illinois, the school then has the affirmative obligation to evaluate this again and to say, is this in fact a sincerely held belief? So in other words, the way that the laws read, there's a burden on the parents, there's a burden on the doctors, there's a burden on the schools. And obviously, this is tough to do. And people are busy. And I've not heard about many schools or any schools actually from the research I've done, that have given pushback on a religious exemption. If the doctor signs off on it, the school usually accepts it. So then the burden becomes on the doctor. And, here it's tough to know exactly what's going on. At least anecdotally, there are certainly doctors who are more willing to accept fairly broad explanations of religious exemptions. And this has caused some states to be concerned about it. And again, we come to the question of, if there's not a religious exemption generally, can there be a religious exemption? Or should we prohibit a religious exemption specifically for a vaccine to fight coronavirus? There are also 15 states that have philosophical exemptions, which literally require the parent to say, this just doesn't comply with my moral code. There have been numerous varied, interesting constitutional challenges to requiring people to be vaccinated or to mandatory vaccines, generally speaking, though specifically these challenges have been to either not allowing an exemption, like not having a religious exemption, or some penalty that's imposed on somebody who is not vaccinated. The landmark case is Jacobson v. Massachusetts, which was a case, 1906. We already see people being resistant to vaccination. And in Jacobson, the Supreme Court says that there is an interest in public health and safety. And given that, it's a power of the states, a police power of the states, to be able to pass laws about public health and safety. And Jacobson is still very much good law. Jacobson is cited in cases that talk about why there can in fact be exemptions, why kids can in fact be not allowed into school, either because they aren't vaccinated, or sometimes, and this is an interesting case, and again, I'm happy to share more information about this, recent-ish, 5 years ago, a case out of the Second Circuit where children had religious exemptions, were attending school, but then there was an outbreak of chickenpox, and the law in New York said that if there's an outbreak of vaccine preventable disease, then even if you have a religious exemption that allows you to attend school, generally, even if you're not vaccinated, if there's an outbreak of a vaccine preventable disease, you might still not be allowed to go to school. That's interesting to me because it may be that the answer in the laws is that maybe there can be modifications made, again, that are specific to the vaccine that causes coronavirus that could be worded so that people don't do X, whether it's going to school, going to public spaces, etc. The constitutional challenges, the main ones have been about, the argument that this violates free speech, that it violates religion, and then of course 14th Amendment challenges, arguments that people are not being treated equally if certain people are excluded from going to school, arguments that it violates a substantive due process. And yeah, via chat, I really appreciate Mr. Gallardo's comment that recently you might have heard about, the various cases by a legislator challenging Governor Pritzker's stay-at-home order. And Jacobson is absolutely used as, again, just as support for the idea that there are certain powers that states have, and those may well include public health, and that includes mandating vaccines. I want to, give us time for conversation. So I want to briefly touch on two more things, and then I would love to open this up to conversation. This is a pretty busy slide, so let me just winnow it down for you. When I think about litigation as a strategy, one of the things that I think about is who is doing the suing and who are they suing. And you may be familiar with, you're probably familiar with lawsuits against vaccine manufacturers alleging vaccine injury. You may also know that in the late 80s, the federal government created both a court and a compensation system. And a lot of the thinking behind this was that there should be funds set aside by the government to compensate people who can prove a vaccine-related injury so that it doesn't come from the pharmaceutical companies so that they can continue to develop vaccines so that we don't bankrupt those companies. And then obviously, giving at least a nod to the possibility that there might be vaccine-related injuries. And I think to say there's never vaccine-related injuries is, a dangerous thing to say. I think some people inflate those. So there's a lot of confusion about the proof for those. But the counterpoint to it that really I think is worth starting a conversation about is, well, if we're using litigation as a strategy in whatever form it takes, what about using litigation as a strategy for encouraging people to vaccinate? What about saying, if somebody gets sick and they can prove that it was because somebody else wasn't vaccinated, they have a cause of action? I don't think that, given our current legal system, there's anything that really allows for this, because proving that it is an intentional wrong would be very hard. Even proving that it's negligence, and for any of my former students who are on here or current students, this is, torts 101, right? So 5 elements of negligence, as they're, often described. In order to prove that somebody was negligent, you have to prove causation. And obviously that becomes very difficult when you're talking about a failure to do anything, but certainly a failure to vaccinate. But since I'm talking about law regarding COVID-19, broadly speaking, I wanted to at least touch on this because there's scholarship talking about this as a possible legal strategy. So ultimately, I think there are right now more questions than answers. I wanted to leave us feeling somewhat hopeful. I have to admit that when I was watching one of the sites that has like a live vaccine tracker, vaccine development tracker, and then I started looking at sites that track deaths that are happening from coronavirus in the US and around the world. Going down that rabbit hole, I happened upon a site that was showing in live time, a census type website that is showing births around the world, and you see all these new people coming into the world, and it gives us some hope. But I think that with the development of vaccines that's happening, with the rapid development of vaccines, one of the things that we as lawyers can think about is there something we can do in terms of legislation or possibly litigation, but certainly legislation, or any sort of regulations even, that incentivize and promote the development of these vaccines, that ensure that they're being developed in a way that will make them safe, in a way that will make them effective. How do we speed this up as lawyers? And then once the vaccine is developed, this is where I think the work of the lawyers and the legislators becomes crucial. How do we make sure that people are actually getting the vaccine? So I would absolutely love to open it up to questions and comments for this. If you chat in, I will be able to see your chat. If you want to just speak up, you can unmute yourself. We don't have so many people here that would be unmanageable. So you're welcome to do that as well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback.
Hi, Professor Green.
Hi, Megan.
How are you?
Good.
Good. Thank you so much for doing this. This was a really interesting topic. And I was just thinking, you were talking about different ways that we could, essentially like dealing with people who potentially don't want to or cannot get vaccinated. I think we're at a really interesting point in time, given that most of the country has had to either do remote working or remote learning in the past, 5 months or so.
Yes.
So it could be something where and when students, start their schoolings, you're required to get certain vaccinations like meningitis and things like that. So maybe something that could happen would be requirements that as you're entering into school or you're starting a new job, there's certain vaccinations that you have to get. And if you choose not to or can't get them, then, you have the option of moving to a remote learning environment or a remote work environment where you can still be engaged. You're not necessarily being punished and denied access to education or denied the right to work, but you're also keeping yourself safe, keeping your coworkers and your classmates safe.
Yeah.
I don't know what kind of loopholes or other issues that might come up with it, but I think it's kind of an interesting time that we're in and seeing what other creative alternatives there could be to this.
Absolutely, Megan. That's a great point, and I think that that's just a great point. Full stop. I think the fact that you're also thinking about creative solutions is pretty terrific. Megan just finished her first year at John Marshall. If anybody here is an alum and is hiring, Megan is an amazing student. But I think for anyone thinking creatively about this, but especially for lawyers thinking creatively about this, that's a huge thing. And, one of the things related to the point that Megan made, kind of saying, okay, look, you can, and then let's keep this maybe specific to the vaccine that would prevent coronavirus. Maybe we say to people, okay, well, look, you can get vaccinated and you can go to school or do X. There are, this gets into a whole other area, but, serving in the military, working in certain health professions. If you get the vaccine, you can do it. If not, at least for education, you do it remotely. And I think then the question turns to, okay, but then if the public schools are required to produce education and to provide education, how is that done equitably? Are the people who are then choosing to learn remotely getting the same level of education? And how do we make sure that teachers have the bandwidth to do that? But I think that's a great point. Other comments here?
Hi, Professor Green.
Hi.
Sorry. Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say maybe along with what Megan was saying, it might push some states to start allowing public K through 12 because Illinois doesn't have that. And so maybe it would push some states to do that, even for those parents who are concerned about even sending their kids back to school. Because my best friend doesn't want to, but at the same time, she doesn't want them to lose their educational opportunities either. And she doesn't have the financial means to send her kids to private K through 12 because Illinois doesn't have a public K through 12 program.
Right, right. I think that's a very good point too. And again, it's interesting because I think as lawyers, we come at this from different perspectives, whether our concern is, sort of school law and we focus on that, or employment law. But yes, absolutely. I think thinking about ways that this can be done, because the other part of thinking about this disease, I think, is that, this pandemic is, nobody really knows what's happening, and everybody's very scared, and everybody's reacting with their gut. I mean, anybody here who, knows me from my work in my neighborhood in River Forest near Oak Park, OPRF High School, we're having so many heated conversations about this, and it's because nobody really knows, and how are we going to protect our kids? So yeah, absolutely. I see a chat from Amber about the vaccine court. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that, so please.
Hi everyone, my name is Amber. I'm an alum. I graduated in 2012 when it was just John Marshall. I see the building there behind Professor Green. I have been to Chicago. One interesting thing, so I went to law school because I have a PhD in molecular pharmacology. So I decided I was going to go to John Marshall and become a patent attorney. Now I work at Vaccine Court in Washington, DC. None of those things happened, but I'm happy where I'm at. And I always tell students, it's interesting because it's two things I learned, but I learned a little late. I used to ask people, how did you become this type of a lawyer? And they said, well, it was my first job. I didn't understand exactly what that meant. And here I am 10 years later, still in my first job. And I'm not unhappy about that, but now I understand. And then the other thing is that, I went to John Marshall to be a patent attorney. I wanted to be on the patent review. I actually got onto John Marshall's law review. I wrote about other stuff. And what law school taught me was that there was a lot of avenues out there. And so I thought this is where I wanted, but that's it. Neither here nor there now. So yes, I work in vaccine court. And so what my thought was with all of this is that, many of my clients are clients who have mandates because they're healthcare workers and they have to get the flu vaccine every year. And my concern right now is that the vaccine court is in a very big state of disarray. Professor did actually, you do not, this is a national court. It is a national court. It was started in the 80s. There are some great books about that. I don't know, maybe Professor Green and I could talk about doing another talk, and I could give talks to people about the court. But the point that I wanted to bring right now is that with the COVID bill that is on the Hill, this court was designed and started in the 80s. We used to get about 300 filings a year. Due to lots of various things that have happened, the court now gets about over 1,500 filings a year. That does sound like a lot, but a lot of different things. There is vaccines go on the table. We now cover adults. Everybody gets a flu vaccine every year. Like all these different things have brought the number of vaccines that we have versus the number of injuries. It's debatable. But when you come to this court, if you have an injury, currently the court is suffering a huge backlog. HHS is taking at least a year to sometimes 2 years to even review a claim before you even get an answer. And this is a court that was designed especially for children, and then you have unfortunately catastrophic cases and people that need life care plans. And this is supposed to be a program. You can get into a lot of the different problems with it, but you have people that are, for example, they're on Medicaid. It doesn't make sense for them to get off Medicaid for their children and to go through this program if the government isn't, playing by the rules. And it's supposed to be a less adversarial program. It's being treated like a tort program. We do not have discovery. We don't have the tools of torts. It has been very, very hard fought battle. It's getting worse and worse. I don't think it's, I think it's multifactorial from all different sides. But the point that I'm trying to get out there right now is that we've been trying to push for legislation. We only have 8 special masters by law. Those special masters have so many cases on their dockets, they really cannot do them justice. And we have legislation that we've been trying to push to get 16 special masters. And right now they're trying to hide it into the COVID bill, which, as we know, is maybe not even going forward. And so between all kinds of different other areas, it's a very interesting area of law. I feel as if it's an area that may blow up because my scientist side worries about pushing vaccines out too quickly, for sure. I'm very pro-vaccine, I'm very pro-science, and I happen to be, oddly, the only person that I know of in this area of law that has this interesting connection, being able to kind of do both. It's really an area of law where I should have never been welcomed because it's supposed to be less adversarial, and you're not supposed to need me to translate. I should be doing Daubert hearings for, you know, mass products liability and some big firm that's, you know, environmental toxic torts or something maybe. But for now, I'm actually very happy. I have my own, I just recently went out on my own, and so I have my own book of business, and I'm working from home. And it is a very interesting field that I didn't even know existed when I was in Illinois. I didn't know there was a vaccine court there or anything.
Fantastic. And to the question, so this is it's a federal program. The specific legislation is the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And again, email me and I can give you, the link to that, the site to that. It did a number of different things, but it created this special court that Amber is talking about. And it's a court, but it's a special court. It's the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, and when Amber talks about needing more masters, this is because the people who adjudicate it have this specific title. The burden of proof is different here. It doesn't require the same type of proof as in an ordinary case.
In theory.
In theory, right. But yeah, so this is a scheme at the federal level to have compensation. Okay, so then I think the question that Mr. Gallardo asks is really interesting, and Amber, maybe you can address this. Could there be something like this at state levels? And as somebody who teaches conflicts of law and civil procedure, I'm already thinking I shouldn't even ask that, because what if different states have different legislation, and who do you get to recover from, say, for a vaccine injury in Illinois that, was caused by a manufacturer in, Delaware or something like that. But
right. So yeah. The act actually takes liability away from the pharmaceutical companies, and for the vaccines that are covered, and my understanding is that COVID, they either think it's going to become an annual vaccine like the flu, or they're going to have a special pandemic type of program, which is what they've done in the past, like with the 1979 swine flu vaccine. You do have programs that pop up. You had in 2009, you had a narcolepsy program pop up over in Europe after their H1N1 pandemics vaccine caused an epidemiology signal and an increase in narcolepsy. And so there are these programs. There's very limited damages, but as far as going through and trying to sue the manufacturers, they are insulated from liability, and they will be insulated from COVID liability. So this is the program that you have to go to. And my worry is that this program is already failing the few adverse effects that we do have from vaccines that were well studied. I mean, it is a slight concern. And then my other issue is just, it's the way the cases are handled in this court and this program. It is supposed to be less adversarial, but I can tell you that every case is hard fought. Half of the cases that we see are actually related to vaccine administration being improper. So this is my public service announcement to everyone who goes and gets a vaccine. Please understand that, especially in Illinois, that there's a proper way to get a vaccine. And in the wintertime, a lot of people, if they go to a pharmacy, they're sitting and the person is standing. You need to be at the same level as the person that is administering the vaccine. And the other thing that happens in the winter is we have a tendency to just pull our shirt down because we don't want to take all the layers off. You really should be taking the layers off. You should be putting 3 fingers here, and you should be drawing a circle down in the meaty part of your muscle, which you may or may not be able to see. And you should be watching the person administering your vaccine. I hate to have to give that public service announcement, because rather than filing multiple claims, I would much rather the government send out a brochure to everybody and say, this is something that can happen, and here's how you prevent it. But unfortunately, we're instead fighting over whether or not they're actually trying to the government is instead fighting to remove this as an injury from the court. So that was
absolutely, and that's the other part of it, right? I mean, I think part of the role, and this is, I would say, maybe quasi-governmental, although we see as part of efforts at every level, here in Illinois, both a mandate to wear masks, but then also kind of a public education campaign about the importance of it. So it allows for, I think, really interesting intersection between lawyers and other people who are concerned about this. I wanted to address two more questions that had come in via chat before we wrap up. So Ms. Arndt asked a really good question, and that is, how does somebody who is, say, over 75, how do you, where would one over 75 expect to find pressure to have the shot? Who is going to incentivize this or mandate this? And if it's a mandate, how do you enforce it for somebody who is of that age? And yeah, I was, and Amber chimed in, I think that, doctors' offices, I think it would be tough and grueling, but pediatricians have done it to say, I won't see you unless you're vaccinated. I mean, pediatricians who have done it have the ability to, have patients who, they have the luxury of being able to say, we'll have enough patients and we need to promote vaccines and we're not going to see you if you're not vaccinating. So maybe that, but obviously it becomes tougher. It's easier for the populations who need to engage in public services like school, et cetera. And also a question from Kelly Turner. So Kelly is a friend of mine, and more importantly for this, she's senior counsel at the American Arbitration Foundation. And this question is a good one. Successful tort suits against individuals to be vaccinated cause somebody to get sick? No, not successful lawsuits. As anybody in my household will tell you, because, everybody hears me talking about all of this all the time. My husband's a lawyer too. The question, and Kelly's question, is exactly the right way to word this. It's not, can you sue? Yeah, sure, you can sue anybody over anything. It's, can you sue successfully? And no, because I think that the level of proof that's required in just bringing it as an ordinary tort claim is almost impossible. I think there's probably a duty to protect public health. There may even be a breach that can be proven if somebody fails to vaccinate when it's clearly established that they should be vaccinating. And there's, harm that can be proven. But when we get to the question of causation, boy, that becomes really tough. How do you prove that it was literally that person's failure to vaccinate? This is why one of the things I think about is, could there be legislation that creates a different scheme, different causes of action? Maybe not with a special court, maybe just an ordinary court, but, we've had legislation about litigation. We've had laws passed that allows, say, for, suits for wrongful death. That wasn't originally in our tort scheme, but becomes a cause of action because of legislation. Is this something that's even worth discussing, in the various things that we're discussing? It is now 1 o'clock, and I am conscious of everybody's time. I want to make sure that I don't miss anything that anybody really wants to ask or mention. So maybe, I'll just, give us maybe, just a few more minutes. Anyone have, comments or questions that they want to express now?
So I was actually just curious about vaccines and as it relates to patents, and like if there's any kind of precedent to like how the US Patent Office has dealt with like global pandemics or even just like health crises within the states. Is there past examples where they've like kind of let the patents or like let the vaccines go unpatentable for a period of time? Like, what is there a roadmap that we can follow?
Well, okay, so I'm going to let Amber handle this. The one thing I want to say, like, let me throw it to somebody who knows about patents. But in answer to Megan's question, one interesting corollary that I've noticed is some of the advocacy work that I do, separate from being a lawyer and a law professor, advocacy for medications and treatments for the primary immune disease that 3 of my 4 sons have. One of the things that's discussed is exactly what Megan is asking about, and that is, how do you incentivize it, either with, making it making it easier to get a patent, having patents last longer, something to promote research in this. There's a lot of conversation in people who advocate for rare diseases about pushing for this and somehow incentivizing this. It's interesting to think about, because when we think about a vaccine for COVID, to prevent the virus that causes coronavirus, I think there's already a pretty huge incentive to do it. But that's, something to think about. But Amber, go ahead. The part of Megan's question about sort of.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know as much about patents, but I do know, and for a very long time, I mean, that was more of my focus. But the only thing that I was thinking in that question is that I'm not sure that the incentivizing is much of a problem. We switched since the last pandemic of vaccine that I'm aware of. We've switched from we've switched to a first to file system. So I think that most big companies that are working together, the issues with patent law right now are who actually owns what technology and who has what and how much and who's getting the royalties. And one of the things that's actually kind of a concern, in my opinion, is the fact that it's also the federal government who has patent and money stakes in these vaccines now. The HPV vaccine was, you may be hearing right now about how they're doing clinical trials simultaneously, and they're trying to make it seem as if simultaneous clinical trials are necessary because we have a pandemic. They were actually have been done long before we had a pandemic and a need to try to get a faster vaccine. So what that means when they're doing them simultaneously is means they haven't finished phase 1 when they've started phase 2, and they haven't finished phase 2 when they've started phase 3, and they haven't finished phase 3 when they're rolling out production and actually giving these in marketing. And some of the problems with that is the fact that and unfortunately, I don't want to think this way, but it worries me because the government also has a hand in the money that's being made, because the scientists through NIH and all of that are, working also with the pharmaceutical companies. And so really the biology through patents, I mean, a lot of biology has become, big corporate money makers. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I just worry about, who's doing what, and we got to make sure that we're keeping an eye on them like we do with anybody else or anything else. And that's all that we really can do, because I think vaccines are necessary, absolutely. And I'm very pro science. But it is interesting because you do get a lot of research out there these days, and if you look at the publications, they are scientists from Merck, and it is just a Merck publication, and you don't have the open transparency of the research that you used to have as much when it's coming from the corporations. But I think that's more of where the patenting issues are lying right now, is that there's not any less of an incentive. I don't know that you need to give more than the 20 years or anything like that. I think right now it's more whose technology is prominent, whose is the ones that actually deserve the 50% of the cut or 60. How are you slicing and dicing all of that? I think is part of a big issue right now. But everybody's working collaboratively worldwide on these vaccines. So
right, and that's that's and I think and I do want to wrap up, because I am conscious. Even if many of us are working from home, that's not any easier. It doesn't take any less time. So I want to wrap up pretty soon. But that related to what Amber just said, I think the other part of this is the fact that it's a global pandemic, but there's global solutions being sought. This too, I think, involves us as lawyers. If we're thinking about encouraged collaboration across borders, that is something that's usually handled at the federal level. Is this something where lawyers can be involved? Can there be more legislation incentives, for international, cross-national collaboration? Ultimately, if we're thinking about a goal of, I think to me, the safest number I've heard is like about 2/3 of the country having an immunity, and most of that probably being an immunity through a vaccine, so an active immunity, even if that has to be replenished as we hear it may need to be. If we're trying to get to that 2/3 number to really be when we can, go back to normal, whatever normal be, I think that, I personally think that it's possible. You can't really give up hope, but I think it will take work. I also think, as with a lot of things we're facing, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for lawyers to think creatively about things. It's an opportunity for collaboration across different legal fields. It's definitely an opportunity for collaboration between lawyers and scientists and governmental agencies. You know, I think it will take everybody thinking about the unique situation of this and trying to get to a place where, you know, we can all stay healthy. I will wrap up here. Again, I'm so grateful for all of you for attending. My email address is here. I would love nothing more than to continue this conversation via email. I'm available to talk via Zoom, WebEx, FaceTime, anything you like. And I hope to be in touch with all of you. I really appreciate you taking the time to attend this. Thank you,
Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.